Hello, everyone. Welcome to PPAN's April 2026 webinar, How Flowers Made Our World with David George Haskell. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Anna Gray Anderson, and I'm the Community Engagement Manager for People and Pollinators Action Network, or PPAN for short. Thank you all so much for being here. And for those of you who aren't familiar with our webinar series, we usually host a monthly event, so be sure to sign up for our e-news and check out our events calendar to keep up to date with everything we've got going on. And we can put these links in the chat for you. And before we get started, I just wanted to tell you a little bit more about us. So like I said, we are People and Pollinators Action Network, or PPAN for short, the host of this webinar. We focus a lot on making Colorado a safe haven for all who live here, from people to pollinators. We do this through grassroots advocacy, education, and outreach, kind of like this webinar. We also do a lot of community mobilization and habitat creation work. A good example of that is our Habitat Funds grants program, based on the sales of the pollinator license plate that goes towards creating pollinator safe spaces while promoting community mobilization. And just to emphasize the significance of that Protect Pollinators license plate, PPAN championed this legislation that created the plate, and the majority of those donations go directly to our Protect Our Pollinators Habitat Fund. And since 2023, when we started the fund, we've been able to support 96 projects and have created over 65 acres of pollinator safe habitat. So by getting a plate, you'll be contributing directly to getting those plants in the ground, which leads to more pollinators. And we will also put this link in the chat for you guys. And then I also just wanted to share about our Earth Month fundraiser. So thanks to you taking action, whether that's in the garden, at the hive, in your neighborhood, or at the state capitol, or with your city council, PPAN is with you every step of the way, advocating for pollinators and the ecosystems they support. So this Earth Month, our goal is to inspire 100 people to donate to reduce pesticide use and protect pollinators, including 10 new monthly donors. And we can put this donation link in the chat as well. And these donations really do help support our free webinar series, along with all of our other pollinator protection campaigns and programs. And with that, we are honored to have renowned author and biologist David Haskell with us today. David is a writer and biologist acclaimed for his lyrical explorations of the living world. His most recent book, How Flowers Made Our World, explore the creative powers of flowering plants. Haskell is a two-time finalist for the Pulitzer Prize in General Nonfiction for The Forest Unseen and Sounds of Wild Broken. His books, The Song of Trees, won the John Burroughs Medal. He is a recipient of an award in literature from American Academy of Arts and Letters and Best Book Award from the National Academies. Haskell has also written essays and multimedia experiences for the New York Times, Emergence Magazine, and other venues. He is a fellow of the Linnean Society of London, a Guggenheim Fellow, and is adjunct professor of environmental sciences at Emory University. And from 2018 to 2021, he lived in Boulder, and now he lives in Atlanta, Georgia. And we will put all the links to his books and his website and all of that good stuff in the chat for you all and in our follow-up email. And so before we get started, and as a reminder, please stay muted. Leave your questions in the chat and we will get to them at the end of the presentation, time permitting. And we are recording this presentation and we'll post it to our YouTube channel soon. There will also be an email coming to all of you registrants with the link to the recording and other relevant links. And again, we encourage you to make a donation today through our Earth Month fundraiser so that PPAN can continue to advocate for pollinators and host our free webinar series. A donation of any size really does make a difference, so thank you for your consideration. And another way to support this work is by getting that pollinator license plate. And again, we'll put this all in the chat for you guys. And thanks for being here. And with that, I will pass it off to David.
Very good. Thank you so much, Anna Gray. Thank you, PPAN, for having me here. It's such a pleasure to be with you. I hope to be in Colorado in person one of these days. I have very fond memories of learning some of the flora and fauna in Boulder and up into the foothills and beyond and in the plains. So, and I have just nothing but incredible admiration for the work that PPAN does, both on the legislative side of things, but also connecting people's imaginations and work to the extraordinary interconnections between plants and their pollinators, particularly flowering plants and their pollinators. So I'm going to talk about the book called How Flowers Made Our World, and the slide here is showing the front cover of that book, saying How Flowers Made Our World, and right in the middle of the image there is a picture of a large Brazilian pink orchid symbolizing the exuberance and the productivity of a world built by flowering plants. And I want to acknowledge um, the illustrator for this book is Lucy Smith, who works at Kew Gardens in London, has won many awards. She has her own book called The Botanical Sketchbook, and she has done line art that starts each one of the chapters. And the line art showing on this slide is of a pen and ink drawing of a tea plant, so Camellia sinensis, with a couple of uh, um, open bowl petals and some tea leaves. And so each chapter opens with one of these. And so this book, How Flowers Made Our World, is subtitled The Story of Nature's Revolutionaries. And this seems a little bit preposterous at first, right? So we all love flowers. We get that they're interesting, they're important, but did they really build our world? Are they really revolutionaries? And I hope over the coming minutes to convince you indeed that this title is actually not quite so preposterous as it would seem, that in fact flowers are the major drivers of a lot of recent Earth's history. And my goal for the book is through a series of about a dozen chapters, each one that focuses on a different kind of flowering plant, to put flowers back where they belong, which is at the center of the story of how our world came to be. So I'll give you a few examples. Now, of course, in our culture, flowers are often dismissed as beautiful, but not particularly significant or powerful or world-changing. And this is an old bias. This next slide shows some cave paintings from Lascaux Cave in France, some big herbivorous animals painted with black pigment on the walls of the cave. These are Paleolithic cave paintings from tens of thousands of years ago, and 99% of them feature animals, not plants. And there's not a single flower that I know of depicted anywhere in these paintings. And this is true for other forms of ancient art as well. So the zoocentric, the animal-centric view of the world that we have in our contemporary society is also dates back quite a long time. Now, this is true in modern street art as well. The next slide shows some graffiti from and wall paintings from just an old abandoned water treatment plant where I live, near where I live here in Atlanta. And every single depiction of a non-human creature is an animal or an animal-human hybrid in some way. So there's a picture of Snoopy and some kind of weird alligator and a bunny rabbit and things like that. So people, when they're not picturing humans or putting their names on walls, are often picturing animals or human-animal hybrids. And even in natural history museums, this slide shows two dinosaurs, Barosaurus and Allosaurus, the skeletons of them, fighting to the death on bare ground. And this is at the entrance to the American Museum of Natural History in New York City. There's not a scrap of green anywhere. Apparently, there weren't any plants back when these dinosaurs were alive in the world. So, which is, of course, absurd because dinosaurs, interesting as they are, did not build the world as we now know it. So, let me support this claim about flowers building our world. Um, Before flowering plants evolved, there were no tropical rainforests on this planet. Flowering plants, the technical term for that are the angiosperms, evolved about 130 million years ago. And all these different modern habitats then appeared and were created by flowering plants. And tropical forests are just one example of that. The slide here shows sunrise over a misty top of a tropical forest with some leaves in shadow in the front. So 130 million years ago, the flowering plants appeared, and that's really late in the evolution of complex life on this planet. So complex animals evolved 500 million years ago. Plants came onto land about 450 million years ago. So there were at least 300 or more million years on this planet in which the terrestrial world was dominated by plants other than flowering plants. Club mosses and tree ferns and conifers and other relatives of those groups. No flowers. And then about 130 million years ago, flowers evolved. And within a few million years, they took over most of the habitats on this planet. So in the big picture, flowers really are revolutionaries. They overturned the old order of things and they didn't just build tropical forests. Think about deciduous forests, maple trees, basswoods, oaks. These are all flowering plants. And the photograph shows a hickory tree in the fall with golden color, and then some uh, maple trees with native vitis vines growing up. And these are both photos taken in the forest of Tennessee that are dominated by flowering plants. There were no prairies and steppes and savannas before flowering plants evolved because, of course, grasses are a specialized kind of flowering plant. They don't make conspicuous flowers because they're wind pollinated, but they are flowering plants nonetheless. And the photograph shows some sort of golden broom sedge in the foreground with an oak tree in the background, a sort of a shot across a little patch of grassland here taken in Georgia. So tropical rainforests, prairies, savannas, deciduous forests. Also on the edge of the coasts, flowering plants transformed ecosystems. Salt marshes, mangroves, seagrass meadows were all founded by flowering plants. And the photograph here is of a salt marsh meadow on the coast of Georgia. There's a wooden dock on the right side of the photo, and then there's rich, uniform green, which is salt marsh, interrupted by a tidal channel going through the middle of it. So these habitats are formed by flowering plants, and they're also nurseries for fish and for invertebrates. They're really important for marine biodiversity and incredible storehouses of carbon. There is more carbon stored, say, in a seagrass meadow, and seagrasses are a specialized kind of flowering plant that blooms under the water. 50 to 30 times more carbon stored per acre than in the richest forest on land. So these are really important in terms of global climate change and the global climate cycle. So many of the most significant habitats on our planet today are founded on flowering plants. Of course, there are other places where flowering plants are important, but they're not dominant. So alpine forests, up in the boreal forests, where because of ice and cold and so on, the coniferous plants do much better in many cases than a lot of flowering plants. But for the places where biodiversity and climate and carbon storage are the highest, often flowering plants built those habitats. And they're the foundation of modern agriculture, human agriculture. The slide shows a field of wheat and then a bag of wheat flour, a bag of rice, and a little jar of cornmeal. These are just taken out of the drawer in my kitchen. 2/3, roughly, of all the calories that humans eat worldwide come from just 3 species of grass: wheat, rice, and maize. And a lot of the rest of the calories that we eat, sugarcane, pasture grass that feeds cows and sheep, millet, oats, are also from grasses. So if we were named as a species for our food, we'd be called the grass apes. We would not survive without flowering plants. And other really important food crops like soybeans and palm oil also come from flowering plants. Now, it's not just major habitats that flowering plants created. They also founded major dynasties of animals. So here's an example of a bee. That photograph shows a bumblebee on some kind of a sunflower, and there were no bees on this planet before flowering plants evolved. Bees evolved after flowers in direct response from flowers. There were wasps. Some of those wasps then evolved into bees. There were no butterflies on this planet before flowering plants evolved. There's a slide here of a black and blue spicebush swallowtail, and then a green caterpillar of a spicebush swallowtail with sort of eye spots on it. Butterflies are a specialized kind of, evolutionarily, they're a specialized kind of moth that evolved after flowering plants. And no grazing mammals. This photograph is, I believe, from Rocky Mountain, from the arsenal out there by the airport in Colorado. Pictures of bison behind a fence. There were no grazing mammals because grazing mammals evolved after the evolution of grasslands. And then we wouldn't have evolved without flowering plants and particularly grasslands. The slide here shows the broken fragments of an ancient jawbone from the earliest known specimen from our own genus, Homo. This is a specimen dug up from the earth in what is now Ethiopia, and it is 2.8 million years old. Our ancestors 10 million years ago were happy little primates living in tropical forests. They were living in the trees, right? Eating fruits and insects. And then some of them, after grasslands evolved, some of those primates, some of those apes moved out and became bipedal primates, feeding either on grasses or the animals that eat the grasses. And that's the story of the origins of our genus and of our species. So not only is our current diet largely supported by grasses, but our early evolution was a matter of ancient primate animals moving out into grasslands. So in all these different ways, flowering plants overthrew and sort of and the old order of Earth and came up with new ways of interacting with animals, new ways of taking care of their seeds and so forth. And I'll get into some of those examples here in a little bit. So yes, flowering plants are revolutionaries. They built most major habitats on Earth. They catalyzed animal evolution. I didn't show a slide, but they also form new associations below ground with microbes and fungi, fixing nitrogen out of the air and extending cooperative relationships with fungi. And because flowering plants invented tropical rainforests and prairies and coastal vegetation, they also changed the climate by changing weather patterns, building soil, capturing carbon, shaping coastlines. And today, 90% of plant species are flowering plants. So how did they do this? Well, there was no single innovation that accounted for the success of flowering plants. Instead, we have a convergence of novelties and elaborations of things that plants were already doing before. All of these happened, as I said, from about 130 million years ago to maybe 110 million years ago. And during that period, flowering plants emerged from being a few obscure little rare plants on this planet to taking over the understory and then taking over the forest canopy. By 90 million years ago, that this was a floral planet. So how did they do this? Well, my book discusses a number of different ways, but I'll pull out just three here today, three of the most significant ways. And the first is that they used beauty to weave new relationships with other creatures, especially insects. And that goes on today, of course, in the work of pollinators. They also expanded botanical motherhood, and then they are very good at going through what I call genetic storms, these periods of genetic innovation. So I'm going to talk about each of these in turn, starting with beauty weaving new relationships. And the slide here is a close-up of a large southern magnolia bloom. These grow all over where I live in Atlanta. And magnolias are little changed in nearly 100 million years. And what we have in this bloom is a bowl of petals surrounding the sexual parts of the flower. And the sexual parts include both male and female. These magnolia petals are large and white. They have an aroma. And so they contrast visually very distinctively with the dark foliage of the tree. Insects like beetles can see them from a long way away. And they also are living aroma diffusers. There are aromatic oils that emerge from the cells on the top surface of the petal, as is true for many aromatic plants. acting as living aroma diffusers, putting these volatile aromas into the air to act as odor plumes that insects can then follow upstream to find their to find the flower. Um, so a flower, these petals are essentially developmentally modified leaves. So through changing their leaf into an advertising billboard, flowering plants manage to attract the attentions of pollinators. The fact that the flower is bisexual, and here I'm using the botanical version of what bisexuality means. In the human world, it means something different. But in botany, it just means that you have the male and female sexual parts in the same flower. The top part of this in a magnolia are kind of these hooks that have sticky stigmas on them. That's gathering pollen. And then the bottom are little rings that look a little bit like matchsticks that are the anthers, and those will release the pollen. So why is bisexuality important in flowers? It means that when an insect visits, it can both bring and take away pollen from the same structure, which is way more efficient and actually entices the insects to visit both the male and female parts. Because previously, non-flowering plants often separated their sexual parts into different male and female structures. And if an insect was interested in eating pollen, and of course pollen is a great protein snack for insects, they had no reason whatsoever to visit female flowers. Or if they were interested in the pollination drops around female structures that were slightly sweet, they had no reason to visit male reproductive structures. So by uniting male and female into the same flower, uh, and starting this conversation using the language of beauty to talk to animals, flowering plants enacted this revolution that continues to this day, but with plants really running the show by using visual and aromatic cues to engage in conversation with insects. And remember that most insects have been nothing but trouble for plants for hundreds of millions of years, eating the sap, chewing on the leaves, biting on the roots. And here, flowers flip the narrative and turn some of those former enemies into diligent helpers. The next slide also shows us a magnolia bloom. And this one, the anthers have opened up, so there's a dusting of pollen in the white petals. And there are also some little black beetles in there. Those black beetles are called tumbling flower beetles. They're called that because they love flowers. They eat the pollen, and if there's some nectar, they'll eat that too. Sometimes they chew on the petals and other things, but they're really there especially for the pollen. And they're called tumbling flower beetles because if you get close to them, they will jump, push off with their hind legs and tumble out of the flower. So magnolias evolved very early on. There were no bees, no butterflies, and so they, as is true for most early flowering plants, worked with beetles, maybe some flies, some moths, other creatures, but none of the more familiar pollinators that we know from today. And remarkably, this next slide shows a beetle preserved in amber. So this is an enlarged view of a tumbling flower beetle from amber that is 99 million years old. And if you look under the microscope, the scientists who studied this beetle found pollen on the tumbling flower beetle that was from a flowering plant. So we know that these beetles have been pollinating flowers for at least 99 million years. So if you go anywhere where there are magnolias and you see a tumbling flower beetle inside them, you're not just looking at a flower that is an ancient revolutionary, you're looking at an ecological relationship that is almost unchanged in 99 million years. Now that early relationship mediated by beauty between flowers and their pollinators has been elaborated in lots of different ways. Some flowers are pollinated by flies or by bees or by butterflies. I'm showing a slide here with a diversity of different floral forms. On the top right is a particularly interesting one, the yucca. So yucca flowers, as you may know, work just with one or two moths. And the anthers of the yucca flower produce pollen that only these species of moths can gather with specialized mouth parts. And so the moths actively deliver pollen from one yucca flower to another. And then the moth lays its eggs in the ovaries of the yucca, and the baby moths, the caterpillars, eat the seeds. And so child sacrifice is the price of good pollination. But this is a great system for both the plant and the moth, and they've been doing it for at least 40 million years. So moths, bees, butterflies, ants. On the bottom row of flowers here, we've got the cutest animal um, in the world, probably the honey possum. It's a tiny shrew-looking creature that lives in southwestern Australia, and here it is shown in the filamentous blooms of some kind of probably a banksia or some eucalypt flower, red filaments poking out. This is a mammal that eats nothing but nectar and pollen. And so, although we think of pollinators as mostly insects, in many parts of the world, of course, other creatures have become involved. Um, there's a photograph of a honey eater, a little white-bellied bird with a black head, feeding on some white flowers. Again, this is from Australia, and of course, in the Americas, we're familiar with our hummingbirds. And then on the bottom right of the slide, there's a photograph of Stanhopea, which is a kind of orchid. Looks like a sort of um, elaborately peeled set of banana skins hanging down from the stems. And these produce an interesting aroma that male bees of a particular species are really interested in. The male bees visit the flower and they pollinate the flowers. That's a fairly standard story. And yet they also gather the aromatic oils and store them in special pouches on their body. And when the male bees, when it comes time for them to to court female bees, they take out those aromas and waft their wings over them and show off what an elaborate set of perfumed oils they've gathered from the orchids in their habitat. So this is an animal, a bee, that has taken the aromatic language that the orchid evolved to communicate with the insects, and then the bee is using it to communicate within its own species, just as we do when we put on floral perfume or put on, as I am now, wearing a floral shirt. We're expressing ourselves in the human social context using floral beauty. So lots and lots of diversity came about through these interactions between pollinators and their flowers, taking all sorts of different forms all around the world. There are now 350,000 different species of flowering plant, at least, and each has its own relationship with its pollinators. A minority of them, maybe 10%, are wind pollinated, but most stick with the time-tested formula of working with some kind of animal pollinator. Now, there's a lot of cooperation in these relationships, but there's also some deception, and I want to share a few examples here with you. The slide shows a lemon in the background with a citrus flower in the foreground, and bees love citrus flowers because they're full of nectar and there's lots of good pollen there. So that's great. That seems very cooperative, but the citrus plant actually spikes its nectar with caffeine at a low concentration so the bees can't taste it because caffeine is bitter. And what this does is it actually gives the bees a little memory boost and it helps them associate the flower with the nectar reward. And it actually helps them feel like this is even more rewarding than it actually is. So that's all well and good. There's nothing wrong with using caffeine as a little memory boost, as many of us do. But the plant is manipulating its pollinator here because when the nectar runs dry on this citrus flower or when the pollen runs out, the little bees keep visiting because they become hooked into visiting these citrus flowers and they ignore other more rewarding flowers that have got better nectar supplies around them. So the pollinator is still benefiting, but the plant has manipulated its behavior through chemical means to tip the behavior of the bee in the interest of the plant and away from the insect, the interest of the pollinator. There are other examples of this. These are calypso orchids, some of which grow in Colorado. As is true for many orchids, these orchids are deceptive. They look like they've got lots of food in them, and here they're trying to dupe and fool bumblebees. So these calypso orchids have got really cool, bright looking purple petals. And then at the center of each of the orchid flowers, there's a bright splash of yellow that looks like there's lots of pollen because pollen is usually yellow. This is true of many orchids. They splash yellow all over the inside of the of the flower to give a false signal of abundant pollen. They also have, it's hard to see in these slides, but they also have little hairs and other structures that look like they're producing nectar. Now, these orchids have got no pollen or nectar for the bumblebees to eat whatsoever. The pollen is actually in tiny little packets that get stuck on the top of the bumblebee when they come and visit, and the bumblebee can't reach it and they can't eat it. So the bumblebees visit these flowers but get zero reward. They're just wasting their time. So these are known as food deceptive plants in that they're giving a false signal of abundant food and fooling their pollinators because of that. Orchids, there are about 7,500 species of food deceptive plants around the world, and orchids form the majority of those. Here's another example. This is a lady slipper orchid. The slide shows a lady slipper orchid. This is a European one with a big sort of bulbous lower lip, which is going to attract a very bright yellow, bulbous yellow lip, which is going to attract bumblebees to go inside, and then some maroon petals on top of that. And then around the edge of this slide are all sorts of other flowers, yellow and purple flowers of different species that grow in the same habitat as these lady slipper orchids. And it turns out that the lady slipper orchid mimics the aroma of these other plants, and these other plants make nectar. They're rewarding for pollinators. So pollinators learn to tap into the aromas of these flowers and think, great, I'm going to get a nectar reward. There's going to be pollen to eat here. And this lady slipper orchid makes those same aromas, often in higher concentrations than the plants that it's mimicking, to fool the bumblebees to come and visit. And the lady slipper gives its pollinators no reward. So another form of food deception. It gets worse. Here's a fly orchid from Europe. The slide shows a sort of purple-brown orchid that is shaped somewhat like an insect. It's got sort of insect-shaped wing blobs sticking out of the bottom. It's got two little tufts at the top that look like antennae. It's got some little appendages sticking from the side that look a little bit like legs. And for a male wasp of a single species of male wasp in Europe, this flower looks and feels and importantly smells just like a female wasp of his own species. And so these male wasps emerge and they try to mate with these orchid flowers, and they're wasting their time because there's no food and they're certainly not mating with a member of their own species. Instead, they get a dab of orchid pollen on the back of their head and then they fly around and pollinate the orchid. So the wasps are wasting parts of their very short lifetimes trying to mate with orchids, whereas the orchids get all the benefit. And then the last example is a Jack and Jill in the pulpit. This is a flower that looks like a vase with a central purple column in the vase and a lip that comes over the top, which is why it's called a pulpit. It looks like an old school European pulpit where the preacher would stand inside the pulpit with a little canopy over his head. I call them Jack and Jill in the pulpit because they come in both male and female forms. Some of them are both male and female in the same flower, but most of them it's either male or female. They smell just like mushrooms. And so little flies, fungus gnats that like to smell, that like to eat mushrooms and lay their eggs in mushrooms, come and visit these flowers. They fly down into the flower and they get stuck because the vase and the pulpit is very slippery. Once a gnat gets into this, it can't get out. And if it's in a male flower, it gets dusted by pollen by that by the central column structure there. And then there's an exit hole at the bottom of the flower, and the little fungus gnats escape. Well, that's all well and good. They fly into the next flower, which is a female flower, and they get stuck there too. They fall in, the pollen comes off of them and dusts onto the female flowers, and there's no exit hole. The little fungus gnats die inside the female flowers. And so this is a plant that kills its pollinator. So these examples are a sort of good for us, I think, to look at because they put the brakes on humans allegorizing and drawing simple morality tales out of nature, out of flowering plants in particular. So, for example, the social Darwinists tell us nature is red in tooth and claw. It's all about individualistic competition. We should let the poor die because and starve because that's what's natural. So people have made those arguments. And on the other side, there are other people. No, nature is just like a big old commune. It's all about cooperation and sharing. And both of those stories are true. The world is very competitive. There's a lot of competition and parasitism and exploitation, and a lot of cooperation and reciprocity. And flowering plants remind us that if we want to look to nature for examples and inspiration, we need to be cautious because you can project your own human values out, values about morals or how to run the human economy. We can project those out onto the natural world and always find an example that will fit what we want to see. Instead, we should revel in the delightful diversity of floral forms and of ways of making a living. All of nature lives in this tension between cooperation and conflict, which is very creative tension. So the slide says it returns to the three superpowers of flowering plants. First, that beauty weaves new relationships. The second is botanical motherhood. Flowering plants reinvented what it means to be a mother in the botanical world. They did this first by wrapping every single seed inside of a fruit. And here I've got a slide showing several different forms of fruit. On the top left, there's a partridge pea, which is an explosive fruit. It shoots the seeds out. Then there are acorns that are protective, and then grass seeds that catch the wind and carry the seeds away. And then magnolia and Carolina false buckthorn fruits, sort of black and red fruits, emerging in one case, the magnolia case, from a husk-like fruit that are bribing birds and other animals to carry the fruits away. Each one of these fruits, regardless of their form, is a type of maternal care, of the maternal generation taking care of the next generation. And then there's a second form of motherhood that only flowering plants do. So fruits are only produced by flowering plants, as is the food hamper that accompanies every single seed from a flowering plant, almost without exception. There are a few exceptions, and they're interesting, but they evolved secondarily to lose this food hamper. So I've shown a slide here of a wheat seedling cut into two. And at one end of the wheat seedling is the embryo, tiny little blob. It's got some little roots and leaves ready to sort of leap into action when it germinates. But most of the wheat is taken up with a structure called an endosperm, which is food provided from the mother, starch, oil, and protein mostly. And so when the embryo germinates, it can devour that endosperm and get a growth boost unlike any of the other plants that don't have endosperms. This endosperm I also call the doomed sibling because it actually comes about through, it is the sibling of the embryo in that the second sperm cell unites with two ladies in waiting cells to form this endosperm that will soon die. So as soon as the embryo germinates and starts growing, it gobbles up its little sibling in there. Again, this is a form of intergenerational generosity. The mother plant is providing food for the next generation. And other plants generally don't do this or have other ways of doing it that are not also associated with producing fruits. So by caring for their young, mother plants have really given their offspring a boost as they move into the next generation. Now, mother plants don't just help their own offspring, they help the rest of the world. They're mothering the rest of the world. And here's a slide of a field of wheat from eastern Oregon. Think of all the birds, insects, the humans that are fed by eating fruits and seeds. So the fact that flowering plants invented these two forms of botanical motherhood, fruiting and sending their little seeds out with food hampers inside the seed, actually had huge consequences for the rest of the ecosystem because those two forms of maternal care actually became the food for many, many other creatures. So Flowering plants, one of their superpowers is beauty, weaving new relationships with pollinators. A second superpower is botanical motherhood. A third superpower are genetic storms. These are periodic events where flowering plants create massive amounts of new genetic diversity, which allows them to then adapt to new conditions. And the way they do this is by doubling all the DNA in their cells. So every chromosome makes a copy of itself. And the result of this is a plant that instead of having two copies of every chromosome, like we do and most other plants do, has four copies of every chromosome. That seems kind of excessive. You don't need four copies of chromosome to run a plant. Well, two of the copies of that chromosome can run the plant. The other two are free to mutate and explore new ways of doing photosynthesis or growing petals or producing aromas. And this is like a cross between a corporate brainstorming retreat and a rave. And I have a photo of some corporate types sitting around a glossy table, and then another photo of some people having what looks like a very fun party. You double all the DNA, it frees you to explore all kinds of new possibilities. And then after that period of exploration, the party is over. The cold winds of Darwinian selection kick in, and a lot of the excess DNA is trimmed, but the flowering plant, the offspring, gets to keep any new good ideas, like a new way of doing photosynthesis, of transporting water through the body, all kinds of innovations came about through these doublings of chromosomes. And flowering plants, lots of different creatures go through these genetic storms, but flowering plants do them especially frequently. And it's estimated that up to a quarter of all plant species today, flowering plant species, have their origin to some kind of doubling event. Whereas animal cells, because we're so fussy and hierarchical in our development, most mutations, we can't tolerate them. Whereas flowering plants, because they're very modular development, can get away with these kind of genetic shenanigans. So I'm going to skip over the next couple of slides, which are some examples of that, and just sort of go to the main conclusion about genetic storms here and point out a few key innovations that these storms allowed flowering plants to evolve. The first is new forms of plumbing. Flowering plants have plumbing vessels that no other plants on the planet have, that can move prodigious amounts of water from the ground up to their leaves. And this keeps the leaves happy and hydrated. It helps them photosynthesize late into the afternoon when everyone else is shut down. It also moves huge amounts of water vapor into the air. And this is where we got tropical rainforests, because all that water vapor creates rain and changes the climate locally. And then it turns out globally, because there are huge expanses of rainforest. So a seemingly minor thing, like some new gene mutations that allow plants, flowering plants, to evolve very wide bored, open plumbing vessels, actually then changed the fate of the planet by inventing tropical rainforests. Other innovations, CO2 turbocharging, right? So almost all plants feed by joining carbon dioxide molecules together using sunlight to make sugars and other, goodies, good things to eat. Through gene doubling, flowering plants have invented new ways of doing that work when there's drought, that work when it's really hot, that work when CO2 levels have dropped as they dropped through much of the last 50 million years. So this gave them an edge in competition with other plants. And then floral innovations also in salt and heat tolerance from genetic storms. So again and again, when geneticists look inside flowering plants for the key innovations that help them deal with challenging environments, they find genetic storms right there at the center of this doubling of the genome, experimenting with new forms of using your genes, and then trimming back the excess to eventually come back to just two copies of every chromosome. So let me give you one more example of how flowers were revolutionary in our world. And this isn't so much about ecosystems, it's about how we think about the world. So I'm showing a diagram, a slide here of Carl Linnaeus, this old dude in his wig from the 1700s, with the first page of Systema Natura, and a photo of his favorite flower, the Linnea borealis, the twin flower. So Carl Linnaeus is the founder of the classification system that we still use across all of biology, and especially in botany, where every single scientific name of a flowering plant is traces its origins back to Carl Linnaeus's work in the 1700s. If he described it back then, that's the name it has. If it's a new discovery, we put it into one of the categories that developed, that either he developed or that others developed after him. And he used the sexual arrangement, the arrangement of the sexual parts of flowers to create this classification. He produced 24 different classes, and the slide here just says that Linnaeus used sexual parts of flowers to arrange species into 24 classes. So Linnaeus, who was obsessed with flowers from an early age, used the various forms of flowers, like do they have one anther or two or three, and how the female parts arranged within the flower to produce a very hierarchical, neat and tidy classification that other people then adopted because it was so easy to use. He also came up with the idea of using consistent binomial names like Linnea grandiflora or Homo sapiens. Every species has two names. Now, coming up with the classification that we still use today based on flowers, that's a pretty significant contribution. But what he also did was produce a nested set of categories so that we still use today. So if you remember from biology, all life is divided into kingdoms, then classes, then orders, then genera, then species. And the diagram shows his classification of plants, ending with the 24 different classes that he divided plants into. It turns out this classification, when other people realized and took a look at this and thought about it, this classification is a representation of the branching pattern of life's evolution. And although Linnaeus was a creationist, people who came after him looked at his work that was based on flowers and said, this is evidence for evolution. For example, the fact that all orchids have fused their male and female parts into one structure in the orchid and that they have the petals arranged around that is not because every orchid invented that by itself. It's because all orchids inherited that from a common ancestor. And then at a bigger level, the fact that all flowering plants have some form of petals and sepals classifies all flowering plants together. They didn't all invent that separately. They inherited it from a common ancestor. And the fact that all land plants are green is not because they all invented it separately, it's because they inherited it from a common ancestor. See, these are the nested categories of classification. And Charles Darwin said that this branching pattern was sufficient evidence for the genealogy of life. And he called Linnaeus and Cuvier, who was someone who did a Frenchman who also used classification. He called them his two gods. So flowering plants had an outsized effect on the development of biology, including the classification schemes we use, the discovery of evolution, and then unfortunately, the last thing about Linnaeus is that he extended his classification from flowers into animals and then humans. And he included humans within animals, which was kind of progressive. A lot of people at his time said humans aren't animals, they sit outside the animal kingdom. Linnaeus said, no, we belong there with the other apes and the monkeys. But, and the slide here shows an excerpt from his Systema Natura book with quadruped written across the top. Homo is our genus. And then he divided humans in this first edition into 4 racial categories. So he believed that there were distinctive racial categories among humans. And then later he ascribed moral and behavioral characteristics to each of what he thought were the human races. And he was a white supremacist. Guess what? As a white man, as a white European man, he thought white European men were the pinnacle of the created order, and the other races were inferior. So through his work, very influential in terms of setting up classification and showing us the science of evolution, but also, unfortunately, writing white supremacy into the founding documents of biological classification, which is a legacy that provided intellectual justification for colonialism and slavery. And is important to realize now because to this day, people are using scientific arguments to dress up racism and sexism and transphobia and other things in the language of science, in the language of natural science, whereas really these are just prejudices. So Linnaeus and other early biologists were part of that unfortunate early history.
Yeah. Yeah, this is all very interesting. And I do want to make sure we have enough time for questions,
Yes,
because we have some really good ones in the chat.
let's jump
Uh,
into questions.
yeah, and thank you so much. That was so, so interesting. And so first we talked some about orchids, and we have two orchid questions. One is how are there so many specialized species of orchids, and why are there so many?
Yeah, good. Well, the two questions are related. So there are so many species of orchid, even though they're rare in their habitats, because they tend to have very, very specialized relationships with their pollinators. So an orchid makes a particular aroma molecule that attracts just one species of insect, and they have this bond. If that aroma molecule then mutates into a different version, it will attract a different kind of insect, and boom, you've got instant speciation happening. So the specialization of their relationship with pollinators is actually an engine of evolution, of diversification. Um, the specialized nature of orchids is they're kind of tricksters in many ways. They're food deceptive, they're sexually deceptive. They also, when they're young, they don't have an endosperm. They actually parasitize fungi in the first stages of their life. So all of those specializations tend to tie them to very specific, fairly narrow habitat zones, which again tends to make them split one from another.
Hmm. Yeah, and speaking of them being food deceptive, there was a question in here too about, bumblebees have been proven they have the ability to learn from each other, and do we think bees could ever learn about the food deception of this
Oh,
flower,
yeah.
and would they get fooled for a shorter period of time?
Yeah, absolutely. And in fact, honeybees are among the smarter, if you like, of the bees. So they are not fooled for long by the food deceptive plants, whereas there are other species of bee that seem to just go along with it and are fooled. So yeah, and probably the fact that so many bees are actually very clever, and there's a whole field of bee cognition now, was probably driven by the fact that a lot of flowers are not what they seem, right? So that produces a selection pressure on the pollinator to wise up, to develop ability to learn and to remember and to communicate which flowers are most rewarding. So absolutely, Lars Chitka, I think is how you say his last name, has a great book about bee cognition that talks about some of those learning, those abilities of bees to learn.
Oh, great, thank you. And then someone's also wondering how you got interested in flowering plants. This person loved your work on soundscapes, so we're wondering how you arrived to this research.
Well, sure. So as a biologist throughout my whole life, I've kept running into the revolutionary nature of flowers in all kinds of aspects, right? Whether it's ecosystem functioning, including sounds, right? The reason we live on a planet so full of song is that after flowering plants evolved, the sonic diversity of the planet took off because singing birds, all sorts of singing insects got way, way more diverse. In a way, the book on sound was an entry point into writing about flowers. And I really felt that even in biology textbooks and in biology classrooms, we don't hear the story of how important flowering plants are to the development of modern ecosystems. And so the convergence of all these different factors sort of motivated me to spend a few years reading hundreds of scientific papers and going to sort of lots of interesting places to hang out with flowers to try and craft some essays about their importance.
Awesome. Well, we are happy you did so. Um, And then are we seeing more genetic storms in response to climate change? And in that
Yeah.
same vein, um, what's the timing with the storms and like resources?
Yeah, so the storms, the trimming back from the storms can take place over hundreds of thousands of years. Although, honestly, after just decades, many plants trim back. So, yes, we, of course, are producing massive ecological changes all over the planet, and genetic storms for the species that are adapting to those, and often we call them quote unquote weedy species like goatsbeard and salsify, which I remember well from the community gardens in Boulder and is sort of out there as a non-native species in some parts of Colorado. In Eastern Oregon and Washington has actually hybridized between the various European species and been through a genetic storm. They doubled their genome and they're now spreading. So that's an example of species that adapted to this new condition, which is the edges of wheat fields and railroad beds. Um, Other examples, genetic storms help increase drought and heat tolerance, salt tolerance, things like that. So yes, we are seeing more of that. And plant breeders who are working on crops are trying to induce some of this in the lab, as well as doing sort of quote unquote genetic modification to bring some of these plant innovations out into fields.
Wow. Um, and then final question here. Can you share your experiences observing nature that have influenced your writing or just one in particular that stands out?
Yes, and in fact, the last chapter of the book has some hands-on activities for how to get to know plants in a sort of full-on sensory way. Some of them are very simple, some are a little more elaborate. They're things you can do with kids, with neighbors, or just by yourself. For me, one of the most powerful things is just sitting quietly and trying to decenter myself. So going out into the woods, finding a flower and sitting with that flower for half an hour and considering the world from that flower's perspective. To whom is this flower speaking? How did it get here? What are the various sensory manifestations of this bloom? How does it interact with people? But honestly, at first, just opening my senses to the place and the flower and letting the questions just die away. And then curiosity can come later. So I really think that quote unquote mindful attention to non-human beings is one of the things that has been most important to me in terms of a sense of belonging, but also in terms of stimulating my curiosity and then finding things to invite other experiences to invite other people into, because that's one of the things, if we're flower lovers or bird lovers and so on, we should enjoy that and protect the flowers and the birds, but also invite other people into that experience and stitch the more than human world back into the human world.
Yeah, that's awesome. You got a lot of heart reactions
Okay,
with
that's
that
wonderful.
answer. We're all gonna have to try that. Great. And is there any chance you could share your slides with us? People were interested in taking a closer look at them. No worries.
Sure, yeah, I can,
Great. You
and
can just email those to me.
yeah, I'll just email them to you. And yep.
Perfect. Well, I think that is all we have time for. Thank you so much, David. This was a really good presentation, and I think we all learned a lot. And I think we're all going to go buy your book now if we don't have
Okay,
it
well,
already.
thank you so much. Hope to see you all around. And if you've got questions, find me on Instagram, other places, and happy to dialogue there as well. So
Great. Thank you so much. And thanks everyone
thank
for
you.
joining. And one final reminder for our Earth Month fundraiser, as Earth Month comes to an end, we would really appreciate it. Thanks, everyone.
Thank
Bye.
you.